This week on Act Out, Cuba, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. Between my experiences there 2 weeks ago to new updates on US Cuba relations, I'll introduce you to some people and facts that you never knew, lifting the veil on a vilified island that has suffered greatly from US empire, and how education and interaction can cure us of this Red Scare disease. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
How does one describe what's beyond compare? A ghost town of decaying streets filled with the life of street ball. A crumbling building emblazoned with a world map as if to say, your whole world is here, in this insular yesterday. Waves that lap up to the sky, misting under burned out lights, dancing and dying in the diesel fumes of cars we were told would one day fly. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Cuba, indeed beyond compare, because it's beyond what I've seen and far beyond what I had been told. Even in activist communities, Cuba maintains an odd air of mystery. A shrugging question mark of who gives a shit, with just a hint of disdain, a lingering residue of Cold War lines like better dead than red or kill a commie for mommy. No, really, those were phrases very popular in the 70s and 80s, and hey look, Cafe Press even has a shirt with a picture of Fidel Castro on it proudly proclaiming, the only good commie is a dead commie. And in different colors, too. Now, if that isn't the epitome of capitalist consumerism childishly browbeating communism, I don't know what is. Although, to be fair, Cuba isn't really communist. In fact, their official constitution is called the Constitution of the Republic of Cuba and notes that they are an independent, sovereign, and socialist state of workers. That 1976 constitution, pictured here once again as a socialist constitution, was later reformed in 92, noting that the Cuban citizens are guided by the ideas of Jose Marti and the political and social ideas of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Now, the latter three are likely familiar names, but Marti, less so. And for good reason. He was only a poet, essayist, journalist, philosopher, translator, professor, publisher, one of the most highly regarded turn of the century Latin American intellectuals, and a crucial revolutionary in the Cuban War for Independence from Spain in the late 1800s, dying in battle in 1895 and thereby catalyzing a greater push for independence, which Cubans eventually won in 1898. And that's just the brief overview. So while the Cuban Constitution notes a trajectory towards communism, they consider themselves socialist and indeed Martist, or Martian, if you will. I know, I'm sorry, I just couldn't resist. Anyway, so while it's clear that most Americans don't even know simple facts about Cuba, we as Americans should also know better than to judge a country purely based on what its constitution says, or what it calls itself. After all, we call ourselves a republic too. And while Cuba is certainly no American empire, they are no egalitarian city on a hill either. In 2002, the Cuban National Assembly voted to amend the 92 Constitution to essentially immortalize Cuba's socialist system of government. The vote was a direct response to then US President W's calls for Cuba to be more democratic, something we often like to say with no sense of irony. Among the testimonies given at the National Assembly, many focused on a Cuban pride that would not bow or submit to the United States or any foreign power, which is certainly commendable. And apparently, a whopping 99% of voters signed the petition to carve in stone the socialist form of government. However, as the BBC noted in their coverage, our correspondent says only the most committed sincerely believe that 99% of Cubans support Mr. Castro's government. But it is clear that 99% don't feel they can oppose him either. And this sentiment is something that I also noticed in my trip a couple of weeks ago. One of the first people I talked to on the street made a handcuff sign with his arms when I asked him what he thought of current President Raul Castro. The police, he said, and motioned left and right, as if we were afraid one might jump out from behind a brightly painted mural. That's a dangerous question for us Cubans, a woman I spoke to said. Another man pinched his lips and shook his head when I asked him about the president. He continued by saying, you can go into the streets and say no Trump, but we cannot go into the streets and say no Raul. Meanwhile, several other people said that they did like the president and were very proud of his work. Another young man, however, was apparently not at all afraid of the police and loudly proclaimed, "The government is shit. Raul is shit." A street bookseller shrugged at such a wide array of responses and explained to me that many are afraid from 20 some odd years ago when the crackdown on free speech was much worse. He said that Raul was more open than his brother, but still ultimately, no es democracia. It's not a democracy. A point which was made even more awkwardly and pointedly clear by members of the National Assembly who responded like this when asked by Code Pink's Medea Benjamin whether or not it's legal to protest in the streets.
And the question of whether it's you can protest?
En la pregunta con respecto si pueden haber protestas en las calles, las personas si pueden haber algunas protestas en las calles, personas que no estén de acuerdo, disidentes en este caso.
Wow, that was super awkward. Those members of the National Assembly were making the kind of faces that I made in high school calculus class, which is funny because is it legal to protest is a pretty straightforward question, and one that's only difficult to answer if you know that the answer is no, but you also know that you can't say no. The woman who ultimately took one for the team started off by saying that in Cuba, free speech is legal, and then went on to give examples of CIA-backed dissident groups. The answer ultimately ended with a long description of how great their socialized healthcare system is. Now, both the CIA-backed dissident comment and the good socialized healthcare comment are true, but not at all the answers to the question. So I guess somehow it's comforting to know that politicians, regardless of country or party, like to dodge questions, and that furthermore, those in power tend to kind of like it there, finding little to no issue with comments like this one.
So we have only one party, which is the the Cuban Communist Party, which is not nominated.
El partido es garante de la transparencia y de la legalidad del sistema electoral nuestro.
The Communist Party is the one that guarantees the transparency of the elections.
En Cuba nomina el pueblo, que es el que tiene el verdadero poder. El poder en Cuba lo tiene el pueblo.
Okay, in Cuba, the ones that dominate are the ordinary Cubans, so the power is in the hands of the ordinary Cubans.
There's only one dominant party. The people have the power, but not obviously to vote in another party, and that one dominant party is the one in control of the elections, which they can't lose. And while it wasn't noted in the video, the president is also not chosen by the people, but by the National Assembly. So the people don't directly vote for the president. And as we noted in the 2002 amendment, they can't ever directly vote against socialism. And I'm not saying that they should, but hell, they should be allowed to. Common sense author and left of Washington revolutionary Thomas Paine warned against this political atom, the idea that what one generation decides should hold true for all posterity. He wrote that it is the right of every new generation to make its own choices, which is of course funny because we hold on to our 200-plus-year-old Constitution like a rotting piece of driftwood in stormy seas without realizing that the life raft called Write a Fucking New One is floating right next to us. And in the words of an actual Cuban, writer Dimas Castellanos is a former member of the Union of Young Communists who now considers himself to be a, quote, critical analyst of the Cuban government. In a 2012 interview, he said, "Constitutions are always a reflection of a particular time. You can't legislate for what will happen in the future. This was an attempt to put the brakes on history and it is a violation of the principle of the constitutional history of Cuba." Indeed, by trying to save the system, you negate the principles of political evolution that made your system possible in the first place. You officially say, no more revolutions, no more change. And considering how proud Cubans are of their revolutionary history, you'd think that they'd never want to close the door on that potential. And several that I spoke to agreed. They were very proud of the revolution, less proud of the current situation. And for good reason. This tiny little island, almost literally a stone's throw from the most evil empire the world has ever seen, not only managed to overthrow our puppet dictator, but has maintained a government built on anti-capitalist principles for almost 60 years. Meanwhile, since day one, the US has actively tried to bring down the Cuban experiment, be it poisoning Fidel's scuba suit or any number of CIA terrorist plots, including Posado Carriles' bombing of a Cuban plane in '76, and another idea that actually made it all the way to JFK's desk, which suggested bombing Miami just to blame it on Fidel. And of course, there's the embargo, which not only cuts off all trade between the US and Cuba, but also forbids Cuba from using the US dollar in any transactions, and penalizes any companies or banks that do business with both Cuba and the US. For example, just last year, French geoscience company CGG Services agreed to pay a more than $600,000 fine to settle potential liability connected with its use of U.S. spare parts, equipment, and other U.S. origin goods on its vessels operating in Cuban territorial waters in 2011. And furthermore, in many cases, any boats that go into Havana are put in timeout for 6 months, no trading with the U.S. for half a year. In other words, the US has been trying for decades to kill Cuba by starving its economy, a tactic we've also used in places like Argentina and more recently, Venezuela. So when push comes to shove, many businesses faced with vindictive penalties have either decided not to do business with Cuba at all or charge far higher prices to make it worth the risk. To put it plainly, then, the Cuban economy is struggling in large part thanks to us being colossal assholes. And just last week, we decided to up the ante even more, or Trump did. His decision rolls back the little progress Obama made by once again restricting trade and travel with and to Cuba, requiring Americans to get a special license from the Treasury Department. Complete with a list of 180 target hotels, businesses, and stores with supposed ties to Cuban military, this decision isn't about hurting the Cuban armed forces. It's about hurting Cubans, again and more. Much like the Sonic attack, which I'll get to in a minute, it's about trying to prove a non-US sanctioned economy can't survive by bleeding it dry. In much the same way that privatization pirates pull money from public schools, then point to them as a failing model as they stand wiping their asses with dollar bills and food stamps. This latest decision will particularly hurt new entrepreneurs who, following a 2012 decision, shifted towards a sort of co-op style market. Back in 2012, Cuba issued an announcement for an economic goal, and indeed a shift, to more co-ops. Passed at the end of the UN-designated International Year of Cooperatives, the new Cuban legislation permitted, as the New York Times reported at the time, workers to collectively open new businesses or take over existing state-run businesses in construction, transportation, and other industries. As of July 2014, 257 new co-op businesses have launched as a result of the legislation. Before this decision, the only co-ops in Cuba were agricultural ones. So this decision not only supported the communist ideal of workers owning their means of production, but also sought to take some of the economic burden off the state. And while this all sounds really good on paper, the reality is a bit less awesome. One big problem is that as of now, the state still owns the means of production for co-ops. The state also appoints co-op directors, meaning that in reality, the co-ops are not truly co-ops, but rather flat structure businesses within a statist hierarchy. Meanwhile, the state inexplicably suspended new licenses for co-ops about a year and a half ago, meaning that those urged by the state to seek a license are hitting a wall set up by the very same state. So essentially, it's an awkward balance, where the state doesn't want to open Cuba's doors to private industry, but they also don't want to lose control to the co-ops either. And with regards to the former, I can totally relate. Who the hell does want a Walmart next to a Starbucks overlooking the ocean? You want to know what is on the beachfront property in Cuba? A rad little cafe that serves 50-cent beer. And despite a struggling economy being pistol-whipped by Uncle Sam, the Cubans I spoke to aren't interested in a Hilton on the beach. They don't want to change the law that states that no one but Cuban citizens can own land in Cuba. Cuba wants relations with the US and other countries too, but not if that means opening up their country to the capitalist beast of profit over people and planet. As one agricultural co-op spokeswoman, Maria del Carmen, put it, you cannot give land to people who don't care about developing our systems, to people who only care about profit. Those systems, the education system, the healthcare system, are non-negotiable and not something that Cubans are willing to trade for what they call the transnational tsunami of business and development. But of course, those systems are also struggling because the entire economy and the people who depend on it are stuck. Stuck in this juxtaposing limbo of an anti capitalist nation trying to make it in a capitalist global economy. As a friend put it, like trying to remain sterile in a diseased world. Indeed, being fully communist, anti capitalist, or flat structure in this global economy is essentially impossible, something that so many anti capitalist societies have found, including the Rojava region in northern Syria, that still requires fuel, electricity, and goods from the global capitalist patriarchal economy. It's imperfect. It's a mess of juxtapositions and jagged edges. It's people trying to get shit done and hitting bureaucratic roadblocks in many ways like our country. We too are struggling with an economy that, for different reasons, is teetering on the edge of collapse, or at the very least, a slow, depressing fall. It's just that we shine that shit up with more Gap ads and sequins than Cuba does. We too are trying to shift, at the very least, our local economies to more collaborative and less competitive in corporate models. And while we chastise Cuba for being authoritarian, in our free society, many activists are finding that even free speech zones are oppressive excuses to throw dissidents in jail, some still facing 7.5 decades in the case of J20 defendants, whose trials start today, November 15th, in DC. Point is that we, the people, have not only so much in common with the Cuban people, we have so much to learn about history, about solidarity and community. While Cubans talked to me openly, offered me rum and cigars, asked me if I knew their kids in various US cities, Americans cowered behind a tremendous display of smoke and mirrors, afraid that some ghostly sound cannon was going to eat their brain or something. Now, if you haven't heard about this, the basic gist is that some 21 American diplomats suffered strange afflictions that include hearing loss, mild traumatic brain injury, and even problems remembering certain words. Canadian diplomats have similarly been stricken, with some reporting that they also suffered nosebleeds. So let me start off by saying that this topic deserves a full show at least, but since I don't have time for that, let me give you some brief reasons as to why the idea of sonic attacks is bullshit. First off, reports came in that the attack started at some point shortly after Trump won the election, so I guess whoever it was had whatever weapon it was at the ready, and as soon as Hillary lost, turned that fucker into overdrive. Secondly, the reports vary. Some say they heard sounds in and around their beds at home. Others say they didn't hear anything, but experienced the symptoms. So, okay, let's go with the latter example first. I worked in audio for about 10 years, and speakers routinely reproduce audio that is above the human hearing range, which, even if you have perfect hearing, which most of us don't, tops out at 20 kilohertz. So let's hypothetically say that ultrasound audio could afflict you in such extreme ways. Wouldn't I be suffering from all these traumatic brain injuries? Or indeed, anyone in audio? Or indeed, anyone at all? Because guess what? Ultrasound in public places can be generated from a number of sources, including loudspeakers, automatic door sensors, pest repellents, public address systems, and spotlights. Oh my god, we're all in danger! Flee to the countryside, quick! And while research has shown that continuous exposure to these sources in daily life can lead to tinnitus, ringing in the ears, dizziness, nausea, migraine, and fatigue, also the symptoms of capitalism, those symptoms do not include brain injury, memory loss, or indeed concussion, which some of the diplomats had supposedly suffered. As physicist Jürgen Altman told the New York Times earlier last month, I know of no acoustic effect that can cause concussion symptoms. Sound going through air can't shake your head. Yeah, no shit. Otherwise, as a hard rock musician and a studio tech, I would have had so many concussions by now that my brain scan would look worse than retired NFL linebackers. Furthermore, high-frequency sound waves are very low on energy, meaning that they can't pass through walls like low-frequency waves do. That's why when your neighbor is playing really loud music, you only get the rattling bass and not the tinny highs. So that would mean that either the sonic attack would have had to happen via a device practically right next to those afflicted, or via a large enough speaker to reproduce sound at such an SPL, or sound pressure level, as to go through walls, which would be roughly about the size of a car. Something I feel would not go unnoticed either outside someone's bedroom or outside their office. But just for shits and giggles, let's say that instead the sound was audible, as some have suggested. Here's apparently what it sounded like. Yeah, I agree, that's super annoying. Kind of like auto-tuned crickets, but again, is it enough to cause brain trauma? And the even more glaring question is, if you heard that, wouldn't you say something immediately? For example, to a boss, like, hey Jane, could we do something about that horrendously annoying squealing? Or maybe employees just thought that there was some sick new techno tracks blasting through the office. Like this one. Now, I would personally classify that song as a sonic attack, but I'd also classify Taylor Swift as a sonic attack, so with that in mind, maybe the Cubans went easy on us? All joking aside, outside of the fact that science behind this claim seems about as solid as Trump's understanding of climate change, we have to ask the very honest question of why. Why would the Cubans do it? What could they possibly gain from torturing some US diplomats or indeed Canadian diplomats who they're very friendly with? After all, if anyone's torturing anyone in Cuba, it's US citizens torturing Gitmo detainees. And then how? Be it the car-sized sound cannon or the high-tech ultrasound speaker hiding in Dan the Diplomat's pillow, how the hell would a country struggling to pay for rice spend the money on something that high-tech? It is far more likely that, as neurologists told several outlets, the symptoms expressed by the diplomats sounded, no pun intended, psychosomatic and related to anxiety and stress. Dr. Timothy Layton, a professor of ultrasonics and underwater acoustics at Southampton University, said contagious anxiety or another psychogenic contributor couldn't be ruled out. If you make people anxious that they're under attack from an ultrasonic weapon, those are the symptoms you'll get, he said. Mark Hallett, the head of the Human Motor Control section of the U.S. National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, told The Guardian that the tension and hostility of the working environment could cause the reported symptoms and, in close working groups, also spread from person to person in a phenomenon known as mass hysteria. If U.S. diplomats really did get injured during their stay in Cuba, that's unacceptable, be it through extreme stress or otherwise. But the shit show aftermath being used as an excuse to worsen ties with Cuba is no more acceptable. Trying to scare Americans away from experiencing Cuba is not only low and corrupt, it's dangerous. It perpetuates the notion that Cuba is a hostile nation of communist extremists, when that couldn't be further from the truth. So until there are more answers than questions with regards to any brain trauma, I'm going to have to log this as an alternative fact, serving only a very small group of bigoted American flag-waving low-life scum.
You low-life scum.
So the show's almost over, and there's still so much to say. I want to tell you about the streets of Havana, the crumbling buildings under whose crooked awnings I never saw one homeless person. I want to tell you about the people I saw with tables and chairs in the street, talking and having a drink because they can, and because people hang out, no phone screens. I want to tell you about the solidarity I felt between Cubans and even myself, the solidarity of humanity, the fact that things like autonomy, community, and the right to be healthy and well-educated came up in conversation when I asked people what they felt was typically Cuban. I want to tell you how safe I felt walking around, and how much I hated the persistent catcalls in an overtly macho society, and how weird it is to feel objectified but also objectively physically safe. I want to talk more about the debates over what to do about doctors and professors leaving their jobs to become maids and taxi drivers, because the tip economy offers many times the state income of roughly $20 a month. I want to tell you about the local elections and how their ads consist of candidate fact sheets and a picture, no annoying attack ads or billboards about abortion or white genocide. I want to tell you about this fucking amazing art gallery and music venue with flute players that housed incredible artworks that not only criticize the government but span the spectrum of mediums and messages. I want to tell you more about the dynamic and beautiful people that I met, and how meeting them is the cure to any ailment, real or otherwise, that might make you think that hurting these people for the sake of US hegemony is worth it. particularly because you're already free to visit and do business with countries who are vocally anti-capitalist as well. New Zealand, for instance. Just a couple of months ago, Jacinda Ardern became the new Prime Minister, running on a platform that included her no-nonsense perspective on capitalism, namely that it's a blatant failure. UK Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn sings a similar tune in his vow to end UK's failed model of capitalism. So again, the bullying of Cuba isn't about their rejection of capitalism, it's about their rejection of US colonial empire. And on the subject of other countries, let me make one last point here with regards to the latest travel bans. You're allowed to travel to way more dangerous and scary places all the damn time. I can book a ticket tonight to Saudi Arabia. Or France, where 2 years ago I saw gendarmes literally beat the shit out of people for protesting, where a government complicit in the war on terror supports our new colonial escapades in Africa and the Middle East while telling its people, I just don't think I have enough money to support workers. That being said, I love France. I love French people and French culture, and I would be horrified if someone said that I can't go there for any reason. People-to-people communication, education, and networking is a way to not only kill fear, stereotypes, and prejudice, but it's an important tool in building and resisting, together at the 99%. So finally, as we wrap the show this week, I'll ask you to keep in mind a few questions. What do you fear? Why? And taking a page from last week's episode as well, the U.S. empire continues to move forward towards economic, ecological, and social disasters. So what are you willing to give up to stand up? Stay tuned for more forthcoming articles on my trip, and until next week, good night and act out.
De Cuba traigo el son ritmo sabroso, de Cuba dulce caña y rico ron, café como no hay otro en el Caribe, y el más chiflado golpe del bongo. Por Cuba tengo la sangre caliente, en Cuba guardo el alma y corazón, y se alza con alegre melodía.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got